Hello there, my dreamy travelers. Tonight, we step behind the golden eyes and perfect face to find the truth. We thought we knew Edward Cullen, the vampire who loved Bella Swan. But Midnight Sun revealed what Twilight never could. The obsession that bordered on madness. The thirst that nearly destroyed them both. The century of darkness behind that 17-year-old smile. So, before you settle in, please support us and subscribe to the channel so we can keep creating these Twilight stories. Well, now it's time. Get yourself settled in. Close your eyes. Breathe in very slow. And let us show you the real Edward Cullen. The broken soul who found something worth living for in the silence of one girl's mind. Edward Cullen was not 17 years old. He had been 17 for 90 years, frozen in that moment between boyhood and manhood since 1918, when the Spanish influenza had stolen his human life, and Carlisle Cullen had given him something else instead. Something that looked like life but felt more like an endless prison sentence stretching forward into eternity with no possibility of parole. By the time Bella Swan walked into his biology class in 2005, Edward had existed for 108 years. He had seen the world transform around him, had watched technology evolve and society shift, had witnessed wars and peace and all the endless churning of human civilization. And through it all, he had remained exactly as he was in that hospital bed in Chicago. 17, unchanging, immortal. But the number of years was not what made Edward Cullen monstrous. It was what those years had done to him. What he had become during the endless march of decades. What he had learned about himself and the world, and the thin veneer of civilization that separated monsters from men. Edward's particular curse, the gift that had manifested during his transformation, was the ability to read minds. Not all minds, as it would turn out, but nearly all. From the moment he had woken as a vampire, he had been bombarded by the thoughts of everyone around him. Carlisle's guilt and hope and determination to make something good from the choice he had made. The nurses in the hospital, their exhaustion and fear and desperate desire to survive the epidemic. Every human within range of his consciousness, their thoughts pouring into his mind like water through a broken dam. At first, Edward had believed it might be temporary, some side effect of the transformation that would fade with time. But weeks became months, became years, and the voices never stopped. He learned to filter them eventually, to tune out the background noise the way humans learn to ignore the hum of electricity or the sound of their own breathing. But the thoughts were always there, always pressing against his consciousness, a constant reminder that he would never experience true silence again. For a century, Edward had heard humanity's secrets. He knew what people truly thought beneath the masks they wore, the darkness that lurked in the minds that seemed perfectly civilized on the surface. He heard the small cruelties they inflicted on each other, the lies they told themselves to justify their actions, the petty jealousies and bitter resentments they hid behind polite smiles. He heard what husbands really thought about their wives, what parents truly felt about their children, what friends said about each other when they thought no one was listening. And he heard worse things too, the thoughts of men who hurt others and enjoyed it, the internal monologues of those who planned violence, who fantasized about causing pain, who saw other humans as objects to be used and discarded. Edward had spent enough time among humans to know that most people were decent, that most minds contained more kindness than cruelty. But he had also learned that darkness lived in every human heart, that given the right circumstances, almost anyone was capable of terrible things. This knowledge had shaped him in ways he could not undo. He had become cynical, disillusioned, convinced that humanity was fundamentally flawed, and that his own monstrous nature was simply a more honest version of what humans hid beneath layers of socialization and self-deception. If humans could think such terrible things, if they could harbor such darkness while maintaining their pretense of civilization, then what did it matter that he was a vampire? At least he was honest about what he was. He heard the hypocrisy in every interaction. The teacher who preached kindness while thinking cruel thoughts about students she disliked. The popular student who smiled at everyone while internally mocking their clothes, their weight, their perceived social failures. The parent who claimed to love their child while resenting the sacrifice and burden that child represented. The friend who offered support while secretly enjoying another's misfortune. Edward heard people lie constantly, not just the obvious lies, the social niceties and polite fictions that grease the wheels of human interaction, but the deeper lies, the ones people told themselves about who they were and what they wanted. He heard them convince themselves they were good people while planning petty revenge. He heard them claim to be happy in relationships that made them miserable. He heard them profess beliefs they did not actually hold, simply to fit in or appear virtuous to others. The cumulative effect of a century of this had been corrosive to Edward's soul. He had developed a profound distrust of human nature, a cynicism so deep it colored every interaction. He could not take anything at face value because he knew what lay beneath. He could not accept anyone's words as truth because he heard the contradictions in their thoughts. He could not form genuine connections because he knew too much, saw too clearly, understood that the person someone presented to the world was rarely the person they actually were. This cynicism had made him lonely in ways that went beyond mere isolation. He was surrounded by people constantly, his family, the humans at whatever school they attended, the residents of whatever town they inhabited. But he was alone in a fundamental way because no one else experienced the world as he did. No one else heard the constant discord between what people said and what they thought. No one else carried the burden of knowing everyone's secrets, everyone's darkness, everyone's hidden self. His siblings tried to understand. Alice, with her visions of possible futures, came closest to comprehending the weight of knowing too much. Jasper, with his empathic abilities, understood the emotional overwhelm of feeling everyone's feelings in addition to his own. But neither of them heard thoughts, heard the specific words and ideas and plans that populated human consciousness. Neither of them knew what it was like to never experience the mystery of another person, to never wonder what someone was truly thinking, because the answer was always immediate and unavoidable. This philosophy, this dark understanding of humanity, had led Edward down a terrible path in the 1920s. He had left Carlisle in 1927, abandoning his creator's vegetarian lifestyle and striking out on his own. But Edward had not simply become another vampire hunting humans for sustenance. He had convinced himself he could be something different, something almost noble in his monstrosity. He had become a killer of killers, a hunter of hunters. He stalked the streets of Chicago and later other cities, using his mind-reading ability to identify the darkest souls, the men who planned murder and rape and worse. He would follow them for days sometimes, listening to their thoughts, confirming their guilt beyond any doubt, and then kill them, draining them of blood and disposing of their bodies where they would never be found. Edward had told himself it was justice, that he was protecting innocent people by removing predators from the world. He rationalized that these men deserved death, that he was performing a service by ending them before they could hurt others. The blood of murderers, he reasoned, was morally different from the blood of innocents. He could satisfy his vampiric nature while maintaining some shred of ethical behavior. But the truth he eventually had to face, was more complicated and more damning. Yes, he had hunted evil men. Yes, he had likely saved innocent lives by killing them. But that was not why he had done it. He had done it because human blood sang in his veins like nothing else, because it satisfied the thirst in ways animal blood never could, because it made him feel powerful and alive and fully himself for the first time since his transformation. He had done it because he enjoyed it. The hunt, the kill, the warm blood filling him with strength and satisfaction. He had enjoyed the fear in his victims' eyes when they realized what he was, the way their thoughts fragmented into terror in those final moments. He had enjoyed playing God, deciding who deserved to live and who deserved to die. He had enjoyed the power, the control, the sense that he was special, that his gift made him qualified to pass judgment on human behavior. The victims had been genuine predators. Edward had not killed innocents during those 5 years, but he had killed with pleasure, with satisfaction, with an enjoyment that revealed the truth of what he was beneath all his rationalizations. He was not a hero. He was a vampire who had found a way to justify feeding on humans, who had created an elaborate moral framework to excuse the fundamental truth that he was doing exactly what his nature demanded, hunting and killing human prey. For 5 years, Edward had indulged in this dark compromise, convincing himself he had found a sustainable middle path between Carlisle's rigid vegetarianism and the mindless violence of other vampires. But slowly, inexorably, he began to see the truth of what he had become. He was not a hero or a vigilante or an agent of justice. He was a serial killer who had found a way to rationalize his addiction, a monster who fed on other monsters while pretending the distinction mattered. He began to notice how much he looked forward to the hunt, how eagerly he searched for the next victim, how disappointed he felt when he went too long without finding someone whose thoughts were dark enough to justify killing. He began to recognize that he was not responding to the evil he found but seeking it out, that he needed the justification more than he cared about the justice. He was an addict looking for an excuse to use, a killer permission to kill. The turning point had come in 1932. Edward could no longer remember the specific incident that had broken through his self-deception, could no longer recall which kill had finally shown him his own reflection clearly. But something had shifted, and suddenly he could see himself as he truly was. A murderer who'd spent 5 years justifying the unjustifiable. A vampire who'd let himself become exactly the kind of predator he claimed to be hunting. He had returned to Carlisle broken and ashamed, confessing everything he had done, expecting condemnation or rejection, or at minimum the disappointment that would have been worse than anger. But Carlisle had simply opened his arms and welcomed Edward home, accepting him back into the family without judgment, offering him another chance to choose a different path. Edward had returned to the vegetarian lifestyle, to hunting animals instead of humans, to the constant struggle against his nature that characterized life in the Cullen Coven. But he carried the weight of those 5 years with him always, the memory of what he had done and what he had enjoyed doing. He knew what he was capable of, knew how easily the monster could slip free if he let his guard down even for a moment. The decades after his return had blurred together in a haze of sameness. The Cullens moved from place to place every few years, always staying ahead of suspicion, always maintaining their careful pretense of humanity. They attended high school again and again. The same classes and social dynamics repeated endlessly. They integrated into communities and built relationships they knew would be temporary, always aware that they would have to abandon everything and start over when people began to notice they never aged. Edward went through the motions of this existence without truly living it. He played his role in the family, attended the schools, participated in the charade of human normalcy. But inside, he remained hollow, disconnected, going through the empty rituals of immortality without finding any meaning in them. The boredom was crushing. He had taken the same classes dozens of times, had learned the curriculum so thoroughly that nothing in high school education could surprise or engage him. He had read every classic of literature, studied every major philosophical movement, learned languages until they all began to blur together. He had mastered piano and composition, had explored art and science and history until it all felt like endless repetition of the same basic human patterns. The mind reading made everything worse. He knew what his siblings thought about him, heard their concerns and frustrations and occasional resentments. He knew that Rosalie believed he received special treatment from Carlisle, that she resented the bond between them. He knew that Emmett found him too serious, too brooding, too unwilling to embrace the benefits of their vampiric existence. He knew that Alice wished he would be happier, that Jasper understood his struggle with bloodlust better than the others, that Esme worried about him with maternal concern he did not deserve. And he knew what humans thought too. In every school they attended, Edward heard the speculation about the Cullens. The other students thought they were beautiful and strange and somehow wrong, though most could not articulate what exactly felt off about them. They created stories to explain the Cullens' otherness, that they were involved in some kind of cult, that they were too rich and spoiled to interact with normal people, that they thought they were better than everyone else. Some of their thoughts about Edward specifically were flattering. Many girls found him attractive, fantasized about breaking through his cold exterior, imagined themselves as the one who could make him smile. But Edward heard the thoughts beneath the fantasies, heard how shallow most of the attraction was, how little these girls actually wanted to know him, as opposed to possessing him as some kind of trophy. Other thoughts were less kind. Some students found him arrogant, off-putting, creepy in his stillness. They noticed the way he never ate in the cafeteria, the way he moved with unnatural grace, the way his eyes sometimes seemed to track movement before it happened. Their instincts recognized something predatory in him, even if their conscious minds could not name it. Edward heard all of it and felt nothing. These humans were temporary, irrelevant, soon to be left behind when the Cullens moved to their next location. Their thoughts about him did not matter because they would forget him within months of his departure, would move on with their brief human lives while he continued his endless existence unchanged. He had resigned himself to this emptiness. He had accepted that he would spend eternity hollow and alone, going through the motions of existence without ever truly connecting with anyone. The mind reading made real connection impossible. How could he care about people when he knew their every thought, when he heard their darkest impulses and pettiest concerns, when nothing about them remained mysterious or interesting? His siblings had found meaning in each other. Rosalie and Emmett, Alice and Jasper, Carlyle and Esme, they had all formed bonds that sustained them through immortality. But Edward remained solitary, convinced that he was simply not meant for that kind of connection, that his particular curse of knowing too much would forever prevent him from finding someone he could love without reservation. He was a monster pretending to be civilized, a killer who had chosen restraint, but who still felt the pull of violence. A being designed to hunt and kill humans, who spent every moment fighting those instincts. His vampiric nature demanded he feed on human prey, demanded he use his superior strength and speed to take what he wanted, demanded he embrace the predator he had been created to be. Every moment among humans required active control. Edward had to consciously remember to breathe at regular intervals, to blink occasionally, to shift his weight and fidget in ways that mimicked human behavior. He had to move at human speed, had to deliberately slow his reactions to appear normal, had to constantly monitor his strength to avoid accidentally breaking things with casual touches. And beneath all of that performance, beneath the careful mimicry of humanity, the thirst burned constantly. Every human he encountered smelled like food, like the blood that could satisfy him in ways animal blood never quite managed. He heard their hearts beating, pumping, that precious fluid through their veins, and his body responded with hunger that never fully abated. But he chose differently. He chose Carlyle's path, the difficult road of resisting his nature, of drinking animal blood that never quite satisfied, of maintaining perfect control in every moment, because one slip could mean death for an innocent human. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, this endless battle against himself. And for what? For the approval of a father figure who had damned him to this existence in the first place, for the sake of maintaining some illusion of morality when he was fundamentally immoral by nature, for the comfort of pretending he was different from other vampires when the only real difference was that he had better self-control. Edward did not know. He only knew that he could not go back to hunting humans, could not return to being the killer he had been in those 5 dark years. He had seen that path and where it led, had learned that justifications meant nothing when measured against the reality of taking human life. So he endured the constant thirst, the perpetual dissatisfaction of animal blood, the unending struggle to be something other than what he was. This was Edward Cullen on that Monday in January of 2005, when Bella Swan walked into his biology class. Not a romantic hero waiting for his true love. Not a noble vampire fighting for humanity's sake, but a monster who had chosen restraint over indulgence. A killer who had learned the cost of killing. A broken soul who had resigned himself to eternal emptiness. He was dangerous in ways the story Bella knew never fully captured. His control was not natural or easy, but hard-won and constantly threatened. His love, when it came, would be obsessive, possessive, unhealthy in its intensity. His devotion would manifest as stalking, as violations of privacy, as making choices for others that he had no right to make. The real Edward Cullen was more complex and more damaged than the idealized version Twilight had presented. He was a being who had existed for over a century, who had killed and fed and struggled and failed. He was capable of great love and terrible violence, of profound loyalty and dangerous obsession. He saw himself clearly, understood his own monstrosity, and yet could not fully overcome it. And he was about to meet a girl whose mind was completely silent to him, whose blood would call to him like nothing ever had, who would transform his hollow existence into something that felt almost like living, for better and for worse, in darkness and in desperate, dangerous love. January 17th, 2005. A Monday that should have been unremarkable. Another rotation through the tedious performance of pretending to be human, of attending high school for what must have been the 20th time in Edward's long existence. The morning had proceeded with its usual numbing predictability. Edward had driven his siblings to Forks, high school, listening to their thoughts rather than their words, filtering through the familiar mental landscape of his family's concerns and observations. Alice had been seeing visions all morning, though nothing alarming. Small glimpses of the day ahead, mundane predictions about pop quizzes and cafeteria drama. Jasper was preparing himself mentally for another day surrounded by humans, steeling his control against the constant assault of their emotions. Rosalie's thoughts were cool and distant as always, focused on her car and deliberately avoiding any topic that might invite Edward's observation. Edward moved through his morning classes with practiced ease. English literature, a discussion of Wuthering Heights that he could have taught better than the instructor. Trigonometry, equations he had mastered decades ago. Spanish, a language he spoke fluently, along with several others. He provided answers when called upon, maintaining the careful facade of being an engaged student, while his mind wandered through the thoughts of those around him. The cafeteria at lunch was his usual cacophony of teenage concerns. Edward heard Jessica Stanley obsessing over Mike Newton's attention, heard Tyler Crowley nursing a hangover, heard Angela Weber worrying about an assignment. The thoughts were numbingly familiar, the same basic concerns recycled through different minds, nothing that captured his interest. Then came biology, the last class of the day. Edward entered the classroom and took his usual seat at the black-topped lab table, grateful for the empty chair beside him. His last lab partner had moved away over Christmas break, and the solitude was preferable to the awkward proximity of a human whose thoughts he would have to endure for the remainder of the semester. Mr. Banner was setting up for a lab on mitosis, arranging microscopes and slides at each station. Edward barely paid attention, having studied cellular biology thoroughly in previous decades. He sat in his customary stillness, not bothering to mimic the fidgeting of the human students around him, waiting for the period to begin so it could end. Students filtered into the classroom gradually, their thoughts the usual mix of anticipation for the school day ending and dread of homework assignments. Edward heard them without really listening, letting the mental voices become background noise. Then the door opened and everything changed. The scent hit Edward like a physical blow, carried on the wind from the hallway. It slammed into him with such force that every muscle in his body locked rigid with the effort of not reacting visibly. His hands gripped the edge of the lab table hard enough that the black surface cracked slightly under his fingers. His vision tunneled, narrowing to focus on the source of that devastating smell. Blood. Human blood. But not just any blood. This was different, more potent, more appealing than anything Edward had encountered in 90 years of vampiric existence. It was sweet and floral and utterly intoxicating, calling to the predator in him with such intensity that conscious thought nearly dissolved beneath the onslaught of pure instinct. His body coiled to spring before his mind could process what was happening. Venom pooled in his mouth, an automatic response to the proximity of prey. His muscles tensed, preparing for the attack, for the kill, for satisfying the sudden overwhelming thirst that had ignited in his throat like liquid fire. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to move, to strike, to feed. And then she walked into his line of sight. She was ordinary by human standards. Brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, brown eyes, average height, dressed in jeans and a jacket still damp from the perpetual Forks rain. Nothing about her physical appearance was particularly remarkable. She moved with slight awkwardness, not quite comfortable in her own body, carrying her backpack and a folder of papers, but her scent, her blood, it sang to him like nothing ever had, like she had been designed specifically to tempt him beyond all reason. This was La Tua Cantante, his singer, the one whose blood called to him above all others. Edward stopped breathing entirely, the only defense he had. If he did not breathe, he could not smell her. If he could not smell her, perhaps he could maintain some semblance of control. His lungs burned with the need for air, but he ignored it, focused entirely on not moving, not attacking, not giving in to the monster howling for release inside his mind. The girl approached Mr. Banner's desk, handed him a slip of paper. Edward could not hear what she said over the roaring in his head, over the sound of her heartbeat that seemed impossibly loud, over the rush of blood through her veins that his predator's senses tracked with terrible precision. He knew exactly where her major arteries were located, knew exactly how he would strike if he lost control. Mr. Banner looked around the classroom, scanning for an empty seat. Edward saw the moment the teacher's eyes landed on the chair beside him and wanted to scream at him to choose differently, to put this girl anywhere but next to the vampire who was barely restraining himself from slaughtering her. "Ah, there's a seat right there next to Edward Cullen," Mr. Banner said, gesturing toward Edward's table. Edward remained frozen, still not breathing, watching as the girl made her way toward him. Every step she took brought that scent closer, made the thirst more intense, made it harder to maintain the thin veneer of control. His mind was fracturing, splitting between the civilized part that knew murder was wrong and the predator that cared nothing for morality, only for satisfying the burning need. He could kill her so easily, could move faster than human eyes could track, could snap her neck before she even realized danger was present, could drain her before anyone could stop him. The other students would not even be obstacles. He was fast enough, strong enough to kill them all if necessary. 23 students and 1 teacher, all dead in under a minute if he chose to give in to what his body was demanding. The thought terrified him, even as part of him planned the logistics, exit routes, who would die first, how to move efficiently to prevent anyone from escaping. The predator in him was strategizing, calculating, preparing for mass murder while the human part of his consciousness watched in horror. The girl sat down beside him, and Edward turned his face away sharply, pressing himself against the wall, putting as much distance between them as the confines of the lab table allowed. He still was not breathing, his lungs screaming for air, his body rigid with the effort of remaining motionless. He tried desperately to read her mind, to use his gift to distract himself from the thirst, to find something human and real in her that might help him see her as a person rather than prey. But where her thoughts should have been, there was only silence. Complete, absolute, impossible silence. The shock of it cut through the bloodlust for just a moment. In 90 years of reading minds, Edward had never encountered someone whose thoughts he could not hear. Every human, every vampire, everyone broadcast their consciousness like a radio signal he was forced to receive. Except her. This girl existed in a bubble of perfect silence, her mind as inaccessible to him as his own. The mystery of it fascinated him even through the overwhelming urge to kill her. How was she silent? What made her different? Was it some genetic anomaly? Some natural resistance to his particular gift? But he could not think past the thirst, could not focus on the mystery when every cell in his body was demanding he attack. The monster did not care about her silent mind. It only cared about her blood, about satisfying the terrible hunger that her scent had triggered. Mr. Banner began the lesson, explaining the lab procedure, but Edward heard nothing. All his concentration was focused on maintaining absolute stillness, on not moving even a fraction of an inch, on not giving in to instincts that were rapidly overwhelming his control. He counted seconds, then minutes, measuring his endurance. How long could he sit here beside her without breathing? The girl beside him was completely unaware of the danger she was in. She opened her textbook, took out a notebook and pen, began taking notes on Mr. Banner's lecture. She moved normally, breathed normally, existed normally, completely oblivious to the monster beside her who was contemplating her murder in graphic detail. Edward hated himself in that moment with an intensity that was almost cleansing. This was what he truly was beneath all of Carlyle's philosophy, beneath all his decades of pretending to be civilized. He was a killer, and this innocent girl, whose only crime was existing near him, was in mortal danger because he could not control his nature. Halfway through the class, Mr. Banner had them begin the lab work, examining slides of onion root cells under their microscopes. The girl set up her microscope efficiently, adjusted the focus, began identifying the different phases of mitosis. She worked independently, not attempting to make conversation with Edward, perhaps sensing something in his rigid posture that warned her to keep her distance. He still was not breathing. His lungs felt like they were burning from the inside, every cell screaming for oxygen. But he did not dare give in, did not dare take a breath that would fill his senses with her scent again. The moment he breathed, it would all be over. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Edward kept his face turned toward the wall, his body angled away from her as much as possible, his hands gripping his own thighs hard enough that his fingers would have left bruises if his skin were capable of bruising. He was a statue beside her, frozen in place by sheer force of will. When the bell finally rang, Edward was out of his seat and through the door before the sound had finished echoing through the classroom. He moved at human speed, barely, but he put distance between himself and that devastating scent with desperate urgency. He burst out of the building into the parking lot, finally allowing himself to breathe, gulping air that did not carry her smell. Alice found him by his car, her expression worried. She had seen something in her visions, some glimpse of what had happened in biology. "Edward," she said carefully, her thoughts full of concern. "I cannot do this," Edward said, his voice rough, barely recognizable as his own. "I cannot sit beside her, Alice. I nearly killed her. Right there in class, I came within seconds of attacking her and everyone else in that room." "I saw," Alice said quietly, "but I also saw you leave. I saw you maintain control." "Barely," Edward spat. "Only barely. And I have to go back tomorrow. Have to sit beside her again. I cannot do it, Alice. I need to leave. Need to go far away before I hurt her." Alice's eyes went distant for a moment, her consciousness shifting to examine possible futures. When she came back, she shook her head slowly. "If you leave now, you will come back," she said. "You will be gone for a few days, maybe a week, but you will return. Because you need to know why you cannot read her mind. The curiosity will bring you back, Edward. And when you return without having prepared yourself, it will be worse." Edward wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. The mystery of the girl's silent mind was already burrowing into his consciousness, already becoming an obsession. He would not be able to stay away, wouldn't be able to resist the pull of that impossible silence. "Then what do I do?" he asked helplessly. "Hunt," Alice said firmly. "Hunt more than you ever have. Build up your control. Because you are going to sit beside her for the rest of the semester, Edward. I have seen it. You do not leave. You do not run. You face this." At home, he went straight to Carlyle's study, needing counsel, needing the wisdom of someone who had resisted human blood for centuries. Carlyle listened without judgment as Edward described what had happened. The immediate and overwhelming bloodlust, the terrifying loss of control. "This is unusual," Carlyle said carefully when Edward finished. "For someone to affect you this severely, her blood must be particularly appealing to you specifically. It is rare, but it happens. Some vampires encounter a human whose blood calls to them more strongly than others. We call it la tua cantante, your singer." "What do I do?" Edward asked. "You have two choices," Carlyle said. "You can leave Forks, remove yourself from temptation entirely. We would have to move as a family, but we could do it if you truly cannot resist. Or you master this. You prove to yourself that you are stronger than your nature. You sit beside this girl day after day, and you choose not to kill her. It will be the hardest thing you have ever done, but if you can do it, you will have proven something important about who you are." Edward thought about running, about fleeing to Alaska, or anywhere far from the brown-eyed girl whose name he still did not know. But he also thought about the silence, the beautiful, mysterious silence where her thoughts should have been. In 90 years of hearing everyone, she alone was quiet, and despite the danger, despite the thirst, he wanted to understand why. "I will stay," he said finally, "but I need to hunt, extensively, right now." Edward spent the evening in the mountains, hunting with single-minded focus. He tracked elk, taking down 3 of them, drinking until he was gorged. Then he found a mountain lion, filling himself to the absolute limit of what his body could hold. It helped. The thirst receded to a manageable ache. He could do this. He could sit beside the girl, could resist her blood, could prove he was more than just a monster. But when he returned home and lay in his bed, not sleeping because vampires did not need sleep, he could not stop thinking about her, about the silence where her thoughts should be, about the scent of her blood, about the danger and the mystery and the impossible fascination she represented. He did not even know her name. Edward returned to biology on Tuesday with the grim determination of a soldier heading into battle. He had spent the previous evening and all of Monday night hunting, gorging himself on animal blood until his eyes were bright gold and the thirst was as muted as it would ever be. He had prepared mentally, steeling himself for the assault of her scent, reminding himself over and over that he could control this, that he was stronger than his nature. But preparation could only do so much against the reality of sitting beside her. When she walked into the classroom, the scent hit him again, though this time he was braced for it. It still called to him with devastating intensity, still made venom pool in his mouth and his muscles coil with predatory readiness. But he had fed recently, heavily, and the edge of the bloodlust was dulled enough that he could function, could breathe in shallow, careful breaths, could maintain the appearance of normalcy even while fighting a war inside his own mind. She sat down beside him without speaking, pulled out her materials for class, began taking notes as Mr. Banner launched into a lecture on cellular respiration. Edward kept his face turned slightly away from her, not trusting himself to look directly at her, not wanting to see the pulse point in her throat or the way her blood moved beneath her skin. But he listened, not to the lecture, which he could have recited from memory, but to the silence where her thoughts should have been. It was still there, that impossible quiet, like a blank space in the constant noise of human consciousness. Everyone else in the classroom broadcast their thoughts with varying degrees of clarity. Mr. Banner was thinking about his lesson plan and worrying about his mortgage payment. Jessica Stanley was obsessing over whether Mike Newton would ask her to some dance. Tyler Crowley was hungover again and trying to hide it, but the girl beside him remained silent. Edward could hear nothing from her mind, could not access even the surface thoughts that were usually so easy to read. It was maddening and peaceful in equal measure, this silence that he had never experienced before. Over the following days, Edward developed a routine. He hunted obsessively, taking down prey far more frequently than necessary, ensuring that his control was always as strong as possible. He monitored his thirst constantly, assessing his ability to resist, preparing himself for each biology class as if it were a test he could not afford to fail. And slowly, incrementally, it became easier. His body adjusted to her presence the way one's nose adjusts to a constant smell. The scent was still there, still appealing, still calling to the predator in him. But the immediate, overwhelming urge to attack diminished with exposure. He could sit beside her without planning mass murder. He could breathe without fighting the constant urge to lean closer and bite. He began to observe her more carefully, trying to learn about her through her actions since he could not hear her thoughts. She was intelligent, he noted. She completed the lab work quickly and accurately, understanding concepts that confused many of her classmates. She was left-handed, holding her pen at an awkward angle that left ink smudges on the side of her hand. She chewed on her lower lip when she was concentrating, a nervous habit she seemed unaware of. She never tried to make conversation with him, which Edward was grateful for. The other students at Forks High had learned to keep their distance from the Cullens, sensing something off about them, even if they could not articulate what it was. The girl had apparently picked up on those social cues quickly, treating Edward with polite indifference, a lab partner she had been assigned, rather than a friend she was trying to make. But Edward found himself wanting to hear her voice, wanting to know what it sounded like directed at him, rather than at teachers or other students. The desire was dangerous, he knew. Any interaction beyond the bare minimum increased the risk. But the curiosity was becoming overwhelming, fed by the silence that made her so utterly fascinating. He began following her after school. It started innocently enough, or so he told himself. He simply wanted to ensure she made it home safely. Her truck was ancient, a 1953 Chevy that looked like it should have been retired decades ago. The engine sounded rough, and Edward convinced himself he was merely being cautious, making sure she did not break down on the side of the road. It was a thin justification, and he knew it. But he followed her anyway, keeping several car lengths back, watching as she navigated the familiar streets to Chief Swan's small house on the edge of town. He parked where he could see her driveway and waited until she was safely inside before driving away. The next day, he did it again, and the day after that. It became routine, this vigilance that he could not quite justify, but could not seem to stop. He told himself he was protecting her, keeping her safe from dangers she did not know existed. He did not examine too closely what those dangers might be, or acknowledge that the greatest danger to Bella Swan was sitting beside her in biology class every day. But following her home was not enough. Edward found himself thinking about her constantly, wondering what she was doing, what she was thinking about, how she spent her time when she was not at school. The not knowing ate at him, the silence that was both peaceful and maddening in equal measure. So one night, 2 weeks after she had first walked into his biology class, Edward made a decision that crossed a line he had never approached before. He went to her house after Charlie had gone to sleep, climbed the tree outside her second-story window, and looked inside. Bella was asleep, curled on her side under a faded quilt, her brown hair spread across the pillow. The room was simple, barely decorated, suggesting she had not fully settled into this space yet. Books were stacked on the desk, homework papers scattered across the surface, a few photos pinned to a bulletin board showing Bella with a woman who must be her mother. Edward perched in the tree, perfectly still, watching her sleep. He told himself he would stay for just a few minutes, just long enough to confirm she was safe, and then he would leave. But minutes stretched into an hour, and he found he could not make himself go. There was something peaceful about watching her sleep. The slight furrow that often appeared between her eyebrows when she was concentrating smoothed out. Her face relaxed into an expression of vulnerability that she never showed while awake, and her heartbeat, that steady rhythm that was simultaneously tempting and soothing, provided a kind of music in the quiet night. She dreamed. He could tell by the way her eyes moved beneath her closed lids, by the small changes in her breathing. But he could not hear what she dreamed about, could not access even that small piece of her inner life. She remained mysterious even in sleep. Edward returned the next night, and the night after that. It became another routine, another line he crossed without adequate justification. He would wait until Charlie was asleep, until the house was dark and quiet, and then he would climb to her window and watch. Sometimes she slept peacefully. Other times she tossed and turned, tangled in her blankets, clearly troubled by whatever dreams played through her silent mind. Once, she cried in her sleep, tears sliding down her cheeks, and Edward felt something twist in his chest at her distress. He wanted to comfort her, to wake her from whatever nightmare held her, but he could not. He was the thing that should give her nightmares, the monster outside her window, and she did not even know he was there. On the nights when her dreams seemed peaceful, Edward sometimes risked opening her window and slipping inside. He would stand in the corner of her room, perfectly still, breathing in her scent and feeling the thirst burn in his throat while simultaneously experiencing a peace he had never known. The contradiction of it should have troubled him more than it did. He learned more about her from these nighttime visits. She read classic literature, the books on her nightstand worn from repeated readings. Wuthering Heights, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre. She did her homework diligently but without particular enthusiasm. She emailed her mother every day, long messages that Edward glimpsed on her computer screen. She missed Phoenix desperately, but was trying to make the best of Forks for her mother's sake. And sometimes, in her sleep, she spoke. Just fragments of words, pieces of sentences that made no coherent sense. But once, 3 weeks after Edward had started his nighttime vigils, she said something that stopped his still heart entirely. "Edward," she murmured, his name slipping from her sleeping lips, and her expression softened into something that might have been a smile. Edward left quickly that night, fleeing through the window and running into the forest, putting miles between himself and the girl who was dreaming about him. It was too much, too dangerous, too far beyond anything he could justify or explain. She was thinking about him even in sleep, and he had no way of knowing what those thoughts contained, what context his name existed in within her mind. He should stop, should cease the nighttime visits, should maintain proper distance, should remember that he was a monster and she was prey, and nothing good could come from this obsession. But the next night found him back at her window, drawn by a pull he no longer pretended to understand. At school, Edward began to interact with her more directly. He helped her with lab work, explained concepts she seemed confused by, made small talk that revealed nothing of the nights he spent watching her sleep. She responded with increasing comfort, the initial wariness fading as she grew accustomed to his presence. And Edward began to listen more carefully to the thoughts of the people around Bella, gathering information about her secondhand since he could not access her mind directly. Jessica Stanley, thought Bella was too quiet, too reserved, but nice enough. Angela Weber genuinely liked her, appreciated her kindness. Mike Newton was increasingly frustrated by his failed attempts to capture her romantic interest. Edward felt a dark satisfaction at Mike's failure, a possessive pleasure that had no place in his mind. Bella was not his, would never be his, could not be his. And yet the thought of her with Mike Newton, or anyone else, inspired a jealousy that was both irrational and undeniable. He was in too deep, had let himself become too attached, had allowed this human girl to become necessary to him in ways he did not fully understand. The obsession was growing, fed by the silence and the mystery and the constant proximity that both tortured and sustained him. And Edward had no idea how to stop himself, no roadmap for navigating this impossible situation. He only knew that the hollow existence he had endured for decades had been transformed by Bella Swan's presence into something that felt almost like living. Even if that living was dangerous, reckless, and completely unsustainable. The cafeteria at Forks High School was Edward's least favorite place in the building, though he endured it daily as part of the performance of being human. It was not the food that bothered him, though the scent of cooked meat and processed carbohydrates held no appeal for his vampire senses. It was the noise, not the physical noise of hundreds of teenagers talking and laughing and moving, though that was loud enough, but the mental noise, the cacophony of thoughts that assaulted him from every direction whenever he entered that crowded space. Edward heard everything, every student's internal monologue, every fleeting thought, every observation and judgment and secret desire. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a hurricane of voices, all talking at once, none of them aware they were broadcasting their consciousness directly into his mind. Jessica Stanley was thinking about her outfit, wondering if the jeans she wore made her look fat, planning what she would wear tomorrow, obsessing over whether Mike Newton noticed her new haircut. Her thoughts were shallow and repetitive, circling the same basic concerns over and over with minor variations. Mike Newton was thinking about basketball practice and whether coach would let him start in the next game. He was also thinking about Bella Swan, fantasizing about asking her to prom, imagining scenarios where she said yes and they became the couple everyone envied. His thoughts about Bella were possessive and presumptuous, assuming an intimacy that did not exist. Tyler Crowley was thinking about his car, about the modifications he wanted to make, about whether he could convince his parents to help pay for new rims. He was also nursing resentment toward his math teacher, replaying a perceived slight from earlier that day, imagining confrontations he would never actually have. Lauren Mallory was thinking cruel thoughts about half the girls in the cafeteria, cataloguing their flaws, mentally mocking their clothing choices and physical features. Her internal monologue was a constant stream of judgment and superiority, finding fault in everyone around her to make herself feel better. Angela Weber was worrying about the college application essay, composing sentences in her head, doubting whether her writing was good enough. Her thoughts were kind and self-deprecating, always assuming others were more capable and more deserving than herself. Eric Yorkie was thinking about the school newspaper, about articles he wanted to write, about whether he could get an interview with the new student, Bella Swan, who had generated unexpected interest simply by being from somewhere else, and on and on and on, hundreds of minds, all broadcasting simultaneously, all demanding Edward's attention, whether he wanted to give it or not. He had learned over decades to filter the noise, to let most of it wash over him without fully processing the content. But the thoughts were always there, always pressing against his consciousness, always reminding him that he would never experience true silence, except with Bella. When Edward focused on her, sitting at a table with Jessica and Angela and Mike and whoever else had claimed space near her that day, there was nothing. A blank space where her thoughts should be, a pocket of quiet in the endless storm of human consciousness. It was the most peaceful thing Edward had experienced in 90 years. He found himself seeking out that silence throughout the day, turning his attention to her whenever the noise became too much, using her quiet mind as a refuge from the constant assault of thoughts. It was addictive, this peace she provided, this respite from the burden he carried every moment of his existence. But the silence also frustrated him beyond measure. Edward had spent a century hearing everyone's thoughts, knowing what people truly meant beneath their words, understanding the hidden motivations and secret desires that drove human behavior. He'd come to rely on that knowledge, to use it as a tool for navigating social situations, for predicting what people would do, for protecting himself and his family from exposure. With Bella, he had none of that. He could not read her thoughts, could not know what she truly felt, could not predict her reactions or understand her motivations. She was a complete mystery to him, unknowable in ways no one else had ever been. He tried to compensate by listening to the thoughts of people around her, gathering information secondhand, piecing together an understanding of Bella Swan through the observations and judgments of others. But it was frustratingly inadequate, like trying to understand a painting by reading descriptions of it, rather than seeing it directly. Jessica thought Bella was nice but too quiet, not interested enough in gossip and social drama. Jessica could not understand why Bella did not seem more excited about the attention she was receiving, why she did not capitalize on her novelty to climb the social hierarchy of Forks High School. Angela thought Bella was kind and genuine, a good listener who actually seemed interested in what others had to say, rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. Angela appreciated Bella's willingness to help with assignments, her lack of judgment, her quiet presence that felt comfortable rather than demanding. Mike thought Bella was pretty and mysterious, and he was frustrated by his inability to read her interest level. She smiled at his jokes, but did not laugh. She accepted his offers to help, but did not ask for more. She was friendly, but never flirtatious, maintaining a distance he could not quite bridge. Lauren thought Bella was nothing special, too plain and too serious, and could not understand why everyone was so interested in the new girl. Lauren's thoughts revealed more about Lauren's own insecurity than about Bella, but Edward noted them anyway, cataloguing every scrap of information. But none of these second-hand observations told Edward what he truly wanted to know. What did Bella think about him? Was she afraid, curious, indifferent? Did she notice the way he watched her? Did she wonder why he had been so hostile that first day and then gradually warmed? Did she think about him when she was not at school? Edward had no idea, and the not knowing was torture. He began to theorize about why she was silent to him. The most likely explanation was some kind of genetic anomaly, some quirk of her brain chemistry or structure that naturally resisted his telepathic ability. He had read extensively about neuroscience and psychology over the decades, had studied the mechanics of human consciousness as much as current science allowed. Perhaps Bella's neural pathways were organized differently, her synaptic patterns somehow incompatible with whatever mechanism allowed him to read minds. Another possibility was that she had some kind of natural mental shield, an unconscious defense mechanism that blocked psychic intrusion. Edward knew that some humans had stronger mental defenses than others, their thoughts more difficult to hear clearly. But he had never encountered someone completely immune to his ability, someone whose mind was as inaccessible as if it did not exist at all. Or perhaps it was something specific to their interaction, some unique combination of his particular gift and her particular mind that created this impossible silence. Maybe another telepath could read her thoughts without difficulty. Maybe Edward alone was blind to her consciousness. He had no way to test these theories, no way to understand the mechanism behind her silence. He only knew that she remained unknowable to him, a mystery that became more fascinating and more frustrating with each passing day. The irony was not lost on Edward. He had spent 90 years wishing he could not hear thoughts, wishing for silence, wishing for privacy from the constant broadcast of human consciousness. And now he had found someone who gave him exactly that, and all he wanted was to hear what she was thinking. The silence was both gift and curse. When he was overwhelmed by the noise of too many minds, when the thoughts of those around him became too much to bear, he could focus on Bella and find peace. The quiet she provided was like a cool drink of water in a desert, refreshing and necessary and deeply appreciated. But when he wanted to understand her, when he needed to know what she was thinking or feeling, the silence became a wall he could not scale, a barrier that kept him forever outside her true self. He could observe her actions, could listen to others' thoughts about her, could make educated guesses about her internal state, but he could never truly know her the way he knew everyone else. It made her more real to him somehow. Everyone else was reduced to the sum of their thoughts, their consciousness laid bare for Edward to examine and judge. He knew their secrets and their lies, their cruelties and their kindnesses, their true selves beneath the masks they showed the world. And that knowledge made them less interesting, less mysterious, less fully human in his perception. But Bella remained opaque. She had secrets he could not access, thoughts he could not hear, an interior life that remained genuinely private. She was a complete person in a way no one else could be for him, whole and unknowable and real in a manner he had not experienced since before his transformation. The danger was that Edward found himself projecting onto that silence. Without access to her actual thoughts, he filled the void with what he wanted to believe she was thinking. He imagined her thoughts were as interesting and complex as she seemed, her inner life as rich and deep as he hoped. He convinced himself that her silence indicated something special about her, some quality that made her different from everyone else. But he had no way of knowing if any of that was true. Her thoughts might be as mundane and shallow as Jessica Stanley's, obsessing over trivial concerns and petty judgments. Her silence might be masking a mind no more interesting than any other teenage girl's, full of the same basic worries about school and friends and the future. The not knowing allowed him to idealize her, to make her into whatever he needed her to be. And that was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than the thirst for her blood, because Edward was falling in love not with who Bella actually was, but with who he imagined her to be in the silence where her thoughts should have been. His family noticed his preoccupation. Alice's visions showed her pieces of Edward's growing obsession, though Bella remained fuzzy in her sight, always slightly out of focus, as if something about her resisted precognitive observation as thoroughly as she resisted telepathy. Jasper could feel Edward's emotional state shifting. The boredom that had characterized his existence for decades giving way to something more intense and more complicated. Rosalie's thoughts were sharp with disapproval. She believed Edward was being reckless, risking their family's safety for a human girl who meant nothing in the scope of their immortal existence. What was the point of this fascination? What could possibly come of it except exposure and disaster? Emmett found the whole situation amusing. Edward had spent decades being superior about his self-control, about his ability to resist temptation, and now he was losing his mind over some human girl whose blood called to him and whose mind he could not read. The irony was delicious, and Emmett's thoughts were full of brotherly teasing even when he did not voice it aloud. Carlyle and Esme were more concerned than judgmental. They could see Edward changing, becoming more engaged with existence than he had been in decades. But they also understood the danger, both to Bella and to their family. Carlyle had cautioned Edward multiple times to be careful, to maintain distance, to remember what he was and what she was. Edward heard all of it, his family's concerns and criticisms and curiosity, but he could not seem to heed the warnings. The pull toward Bella was growing stronger rather than weaker, fed by the silence that made her so uniquely precious to him. In a world where Edward heard everyone, Bella alone was quiet. In a century of knowing too much, she alone remained mysterious. And that impossible gift, that silence in the storm, was worth any risk, any danger, any price he might have to pay, even if it damned them both. The decision to follow Bella to Port Angeles was not really a decision at all. Edward had been following her for weeks now, tracking her movements after school, ensuring she made it home safely, watching over her with an intensity that bordered on pathological. When Jessica Stanley's thoughts revealed plans for a shopping trip to Port Angeles on Saturday, and Bella's name came up as one of the participants, Edward knew he would follow. He told himself it was about safety. Port Angeles was a larger city than Forks, with more people and more potential dangers. Bella would be separated from the protection of her father, wandering unfamiliar streets with girls who were too absorbed in their own concerns to pay attention to threats. Someone needed to watch over her, and since she had no idea she needed watching, that responsibility fell to Edward. The rationalizations were thin, transparent even to himself. But Edward was beyond caring about the ethics of what he was doing. He needed to be near her, needed to know she was safe, needed to exist in the peace her silent mind provided. Everything else was secondary to that need. Saturday arrived grey and overcast, typical for the Pacific Northwest. Edward waited until he heard in Jessica's thoughts that the girls were leaving, then followed at a distance in his Volvo. The drive to Port Angeles took about an hour, winding along highways that hugged the coastline, passing through small towns and stretches of dense forest. Edward kept several car lengths back, far enough that Bella would not notice his car if she happened to look in her mirrors, close enough that he could track their progress. He listened to Jessica's thoughts, using them to monitor the situation, to know where they were going and what they planned to do. The girls arrived in Port Angeles in the early afternoon and immediately dispersed into the downtown shopping district. Jessica and Angela were hunting for dresses for some school dance, dragging Bella along despite her obvious lack of enthusiasm for the activity. Edward heard Jessica's internal commentary about each dress they tried on, her concerns about colors and styles, and whether Mike Newton would like what she wore. Edward parked his car where he could watch the streets without being obvious and settled in to wait. He knew this was wrong, knew that following Bella across county lines elevated his stalking to a new level of invasiveness. But he could not make himself leave, could not make himself drive away when she might need him, when something might happen that required his intervention. Hours passed. The girls moved from shop to shop, trying on dresses, discussing options, making the kind of small talk that Edward found numbingly boring even secondhand through Jessica's thoughts. Bella remained mostly quiet, offering opinions when asked, but clearly more interested in finding a bookstore than in shopping for formal wear. Eventually, the group split up. Jessica and Angela wanted to eat at a restaurant by the bay, but Bella claimed she needed to find a bookstore first. She promised to meet them at the restaurant in an hour, then headed off alone into the less touristy sections of the city. Edward followed on foot, keeping to the shadows, using his enhanced speed to move between buildings without being seen. He watched as Bella wandered through several streets, clearly looking for something specific. She found a bookstore eventually, but it was some new age shop that clearly did not have what she wanted. She left looking disappointed, checked her watch, and started back toward where she was supposed to meet her friends. But she took a wrong turn. Edward saw the moment. She realized she was lost, saw the slight stiffening of her shoulders as she looked around at unfamiliar streets. She kept walking, trying to find her way back to the tourist area, but she was heading deeper into the industrial section of town, away from the shops and restaurants and people. And then Edward heard them. 4 men, their thoughts ugly and predatory, noticing the girl walking alone. They started following her, spreading out across the street, discussing what they would do to her. The thoughts were vile, violent, explicit in their intentions. These were not men planning simple robbery. They were planning assault, rape, violence that would leave Bella traumatized if she survived it at all. Rage exploded in Edward's chest, pure and incandescent. These men were planning to hurt her, to violate her, to destroy her, and they thought they would get away with it because she was alone and vulnerable and no one would stop them. They were wrong. Edward ran back to where he had parked the Volvo, covering the distance in seconds, moving faster than human eyes could track. He started the car and drove toward where Bella was walking, where the men were closing in on her, where violence was about to occur unless he intervened. He could hear the men's thoughts clearly now, could follow their positions, could track the moment when they moved to cut off her escape routes. Bella had realized she was in danger. He could see her trying to walk faster, trying to get back to populated areas, but the men were herding her, backing her into a corner where no one would see what they were about to do. Edward whipped the Volvo around the corner and directly at the men, stopping inches from where Bella stood with such abrupt force that the tires screamed against the pavement. The passenger door flew open before the car had fully stopped. "Get in," he commanded, his voice harsh with barely controlled fury. Bella did not hesitate. She threw herself into the car, and Edward was already moving before she had even closed the door. He accelerated away from the scene, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the metal creaked and bent slightly under his fingers. He wanted to kill them, wanted to stop the car, walk back to where those 4 men stood in shocked confusion, and tear them apart piece by piece. His hands ached to inflict violence, to make them pay for what they had been planning to do. He could do it easily, could end all 4 of them before they even understood what was happening. The thoughts were seductive, appealing to the part of him that had spent 5 years hunting evil men and calling it justice. These men deserved death. They had been planning to hurt Bella, to do terrible things to her, and the world would be better off without them. Edward could eliminate them, could prevent them from ever hurting anyone else, could satisfy the rage burning in his chest. But Bella was in the car. Bella was safe, and if he went back to kill those men, she would know what he was, would witness the violence he was capable of, would understand that the boy sitting beside her in biology class was something monstrous. "Edward." Bella's voice was small, shaking slightly. "How did you know where I was?" The question cut through his rage, reminding him that he needed to have answers, needed to justify his presence in a way that would not reveal the truth of his stalking. His mind raced, constructing lies, building a story that might be believable. "I was in Port Angeles," he said, forcing his voice to sound calmer than he felt. "I saw you walking alone and thought I would offer you a ride. Then I saw those men following you." It was a terrible lie, full of holes if she examined it closely. How had he known she was in Port Angeles? Why had he been driving through that particular industrial area? How had he arrived at exactly the right moment? But Bella was too shaken to question it, too relieved to be safe to wonder about the improbability of his timing. Edward drove away from the industrial district, his mind still full of the violence he wanted to commit. He could turn around, could hunt down those men, could make them pay for what they had almost done. The desire was overwhelming, fighting against his decision to let them live. "Edward," Bella said again, and this time her hand touched his arm. The contact shocked him, her warm fingers against his cold skin burning like a brand. "I'm okay. You saved me. It's okay." But it was not okay. None of this was okay. She had been in danger because he had not been paying close enough attention, had not acted quickly enough. And now he wanted to kill 4 men for the crime of threatening her. Wanted to give in to the monster he had spent decades trying to suppress. "Are you hungry?" Edward asked abruptly, needing something to focus on besides his rage. "We should get you some food. You're shaking." "I don't know if I can eat," Bella admitted. "But yes, food sounds good. Something normal sounds good." Edward drove to a small Italian restaurant, the kind of place where the lighting was low and they could talk without being overheard. He ordered food for Bella, watching as she tried to steady her hands enough to lift her water glass. The adrenaline was leaving her system now, and the aftermath of fear was setting in, making her tremble with delayed shock. "Tell me what happened," Edward said quietly, needing to hear it from her, needing to understand how close she had come to disaster. Bella recounted the evening, her voice steadier as she talked, getting separated from her friends, making a wrong turn, realizing she was lost, seeing the men and understanding they meant her harm, and then Edward appearing like some kind of miracle, though she did not use those words. "How did you really know where I was?" she asked when she finished, her brown eyes meeting his directly. "You couldn't have just happened to be there at exactly the right moment, Edward. That's not how coincidence works." Edward held her gaze, knowing she deserved honesty, but unable to give it to her. Not the full truth anyway. Not the extent of his surveillance, the nights he spent watching her sleep, the obsessive monitoring of her every movement. "I followed you," he admitted, which was true even if it didn't include the full scope of his stalking. "I saw you leave your friends, saw you heading in the wrong direction. I wanted to make sure you were safe." "You followed me," Bella repeated, and he could not tell from her tone whether she was disturbed by this or something else. Her face revealed nothing, and the silence where her thoughts should have been offered no clues. "Yes," Edward said, because there was no point in denying it. "I know that's invasive and inappropriate, but I was concerned about you being alone in an unfamiliar city." "Because you care about me," Bella said, and it was not quite a question. "Because I am obsessed with you," Edward thought. "Because I cannot stop thinking about you. Because your blood calls to me, and your silent mind gives me peace, and I want both to drink you dry and to protect you from everything in the world that could hurt you, including myself." "Yes," he said instead, the single word carrying more weight than she could possibly understand. "I care about you, Bella." She stared at him for a long moment, and Edward desperately wished he could hear her thoughts in that instant. Was she pleased, frightened, confused? Her face showed consideration, processing, but he could not interpret what conclusion she was reaching. The food arrived, and Bella ate mechanically, clearly still processing the evening's events. Edward watched her, hyper-aware of her heartbeat gradually slowing from his panicked pace, of the color returning to her cheeks, of the way her hands stopped shaking as the shock wore off. "I should call Jessica," Bella said eventually. "Let her know I'm okay. She's probably worried." Edward handed her his phone, listened as she called Jessica, and made excuses about finding a ride home. Jessica's thoughts were relieved and slightly envious that Bella was with Edward Cullen, that the dangerous situation had somehow resulted in time alone with the most mysterious boy at Forks High School. After Bella finished her call, they sat in silence for a moment. The rage Edward had felt was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was manageable now. Bella was safe. That was what mattered. The men who had threatened her would face justice eventually, or they would not, but either way, they had not succeeded in hurting her. "There's something different about you, Edward," Bella said suddenly, her voice quiet but determined. "Something I can't figure out. The way you appeared tonight, the way you knew where I was, things that shouldn't be possible." Edward's entire body tensed. She was too perceptive, too intelligent, noticing things she should not notice. "I don't know what you mean," he said, the lie tasting sour on his tongue. "Yes, you do," Bella said, and there was certainty in her voice. "I don't know what you are yet, but I know you're not just normal, and I know you saved my life twice now. So whatever you are, whatever secret you're hiding, I'm grateful for it." She was too close to the truth, too close to understanding what he was. Edward should have been alarmed, should have been planning how to deflect her suspicions, how to maintain the carefully constructed lies that kept his family safe. But instead, he felt a strange relief. She saw him. Not fully, not yet, but she saw that he was different, that he was hiding something, and she was not running. She was grateful. "Let me take you home," Edward said, unable to address her implicit question, unable to confirm or deny what she suspected. "It's getting late, and your father will worry." The drive back to Forks was quiet, both of them lost in thought. At her door, Edward walked Bella up the path, hyper-aware of how close they were standing, of the scent of her blood and the sound of her heartbeat and the silence that surrounded her like a protective shield. "Thank you," Bella said softly, "for tonight, for saving me." "Always," Edward replied before he could stop himself, and the word hung between them like a promise he had no business making. Then Bella did something unexpected. She reached up and touched his face, her warm fingers trailing across his cold cheek. Edward froze at the contact, overwhelmed by the intimacy of her touch, by the trust implicit in her willingness to touch someone who could kill her so easily. "Good night, Edward," she whispered. "Good night, Bella," he managed, and then she was gone, disappearing into the house. That night, Edward returned to his usual perch outside her window, watching her sleep while wrestling with everything that had happened. He had come so close to becoming a murderer again, so close to giving in to the violence that still lived inside him. The only thing that had stopped him was Bella's presence, her hand on his arm, her voice calling him back from the edge. She was simultaneously his greatest temptation and his salvation, the thing that made him want to be better, while also threatening to destroy every bit of control he had built. And Edward had no idea how to navigate the impossible situation he had created, no roadmap for loving someone who could so easily be destroyed by what he was. But still he watched, still he stayed, still he chose her over wisdom, because loving her was worth any cost, even if that cost was his soul. The days following Port Angeles were torture of a different kind than Edward had experienced before. Bella had seen too much, noticed too much, and now she was actively investigating the mystery he represented. He could see it in the way she watched him during biology, in the questions she asked that seemed casual but were anything but, in the careful attention she paid to his every movement and word. She had gone to the bookstore. Edward knew because he heard it in Jessica Stanley's thoughts, the casual mention that Bella had asked about books on local legends and folklore. Jessica had thought it was strange, but had not questioned it too deeply, too focused on her own concerns to wonder why Bella Swan would suddenly be interested in Quileute stories and Pacific Northwest mythology. Edward knew exactly why. She was researching, trying to find an explanation for the things she had witnessed, the impossible speed and strength she had noticed despite his attempts at concealment. She was dangerously close to the truth, and Edward found himself caught between terror and exposure, and a strange relief that he might not have to lie to her anymore. He should have left Forks, should have convinced his family to move, to disappear before Bella could piece together what they were. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that protected both his family and Bella herself from the dangers of knowing too much. But Edward could not make himself leave. The thought of never seeing her again, of returning to the endless empty existence he had endured for decades, was unbearable. He had tasted something in these weeks with Bella, something he had never experienced in his long, immortal life. Not just a piece of her silent mind, though that remained precious beyond measure, but genuine connection, real feeling, the sense that his existence mattered for something beyond mere survival. So instead of leaving, Edward made a different choice. He decided that if Bella was going to discover the truth, she should hear it from him, on his terms, in a way that gave him some control over the revelation. He approached her after biology on a Friday, the first truly sunny day Fawkes had seen in weeks. "Are you free tomorrow?" he asked, keeping his voice casual despite the weight of what he was proposing. "I thought we could spend some time together, away from school, away from everyone else. There are some things I would like to talk to you about." Bella looked at him with those brown eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts, and Edward wished desperately that he could hear what she was thinking in that moment. "Yes," she said simply. "What time?" "I will pick you up at noon," Edward said. "Dress for hiking. We are going somewhere special." That night, watching Bella sleep from his usual position by her window, Edward wrestled with what he was about to do. He would tell her the truth tomorrow, would reveal what he was, would give her the choice of whether to run or stay. It went against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed, violated the most fundamental rule of vampire existence. Saturday dawned bright and clear. Edward waited until afternoon, until clouds started rolling in from the coast and provided enough cover that he could move without sparkling. He drove to Bella's house and found her waiting on the porch, dressed in jeans and a jacket, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something else he could not identify. The drive out of Fawkes was quiet. Edward headed north and east, following logging roads deep into the forest, far from any human habitation. Bella did not ask where they were going, seemingly content to trust him despite having every reason not to. Finally, Edward parked at the end of a trail he knew well, one that led to a meadow hidden deep in the forest. They hiked in silence, Bella occasionally stumbling over roots and rocks. Edward stayed close, ready to catch her if she fell, hyper-aware of her heartbeat and her breathing and the warmth radiating from her skin. The meadow appeared gradually, the trees thinning until they opened onto a circular clearing. Wild flowers dotted the grass, and the sun, breaking through the clouds in patches, illuminated the space in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Edward led Bella to the center of the meadow and then turned to face her, his heart silent in his chest, but his mind racing with everything he needed to say. "I know you have been researching," he said without preamble. "I know you've been trying to figure out what I am." Bella's eyes widened slightly, but she did not deny it. "Yes," she said, "I have been, but I've not found any answers that make sense." "That is because the truth is something most people do not believe in anymore," Edward said. "Something that is supposed to be fiction, myth, legend. But it is real, Bella, and I am real." He paused, gathering his courage, preparing himself for her reaction. Then he spoke the word he had never said aloud to a human before. "I am a vampire, Bella." The word hung in the air between them, stark and impossible. Bella stared at him, her expression unreadable. "A vampire," she repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "Like in the stories." "Not exactly like the stories," Edward said. "Most of the legends are wrong. We do not sleep in coffins. Crosses and garlic do nothing to us. We can go out during the day, though we avoid it for reasons I will show you if the sun cooperates. And the things that are true? Bella asked, and Edward noticed she had not run, had not even stepped backward. We drink blood, Edward said bluntly. Human blood sustains us best, though my family has chosen to abstain from hunting humans. We survive on animal blood instead. It is not as satisfying, but it allows us to live without being murderers. You have never killed anyone? Bella asked, and Edward heard the hope in her voice. I have killed many people, Edward said, forcing himself to be honest. During my rebellion, I hunted human prey. I told myself they deserved it, that I only killed evil men. But I was still a killer, Bella. I still took human lives and drank their blood, then enjoyed it. He watched her process this. But you stopped, she said. You came back to your family's way. Yes, Edward said. I came back. But the monster is still inside me, Bella. The thirst never goes away. Every moment I am near you. I am fighting the urge to kill you. Your scent calls to me more strongly than anyone I have ever encountered. You are my singer, la tua cantante, the one whose blood sings to me specifically. Now Bella did step back, just one step, and Edward felt something crack inside his chest. But she did not run. Is that why you stayed away that first week? She asked. In biology. I looked at you like I wanted to kill you, Edward said. Because I did. That first day I came within seconds of attacking you right there in class. I left Forks immediately, tried to stay away. But I came back because I had to know why I could not read your mind. Read my mind? Bella's eyebrows rose. Everyone's mind but yours, Edward said. It is my gift. I hear thoughts like voices, constant and unavoidable. But you, Bella Swan, are completely silent to me. Your mind is the only one I have never been able to access. And that silence drew me back as strongly as your blood pushed me away. Understanding dawned in her eyes. That is why you are always so still, she said. You are concentrating on appearing human. Partly, Edward admitted. Also because if I let my control slip, I might do something impossible. Vampires are designed to be perfect predators, Bella. Everything about us is calculated to lure in prey. But you have not struck, Bella said with certainty. You have had opportunities, but you have chosen not to. Choosing not to kill you does not make me safe, Edward said fiercely. I am the thing that should terrify you. I am the monster in the darkness, and you have been completely vulnerable to me this entire time. Show me, Bella said suddenly. Show me what you really are. Edward hesitated, then walked to where sunlight broke through the clouds and stepped into it. His skin began to sparkle as if thousands of tiny diamonds had been embedded in his flesh. Light refracted through him, creating rainbow patterns that shifted with every movement. He looked like he had been carved from crystal, utterly inhuman. Edward heard Bella's sharp intake of breath and forced himself not to look at her. This is what I am, he said quietly, a monster pretending to be human, failing at it every time the sun shines. He finally made himself look at Bella, bracing for her horror. But what he saw on her face was wonder. You are beautiful, she breathed. Beautiful, he repeated incredulously. Bella, I am showing you that I am not human, that I am something dangerous and unnatural, and you think I am beautiful? Yes, she said simply, and then she was walking toward him. May I? She asked, her hand raised. Edward nodded, unable to speak, and watched as her warm fingers touched his glittering arm. The thirst roared to life in his throat, but he held perfectly still, letting her explore. Bella's hand moved from his arm to his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Edward closed his eyes at the contact, overwhelmed by the intimacy of it. "Why can you not read my mind?" Bella asked softly. "I do not know," Edward admitted. "I have never encountered anyone like you before. Whatever it is, you are the only person in the world whose thoughts are private from me." "Is that why you watch me?" Bella asked, and Edward's eyes snapped open. "At night, outside my window. I have known for weeks, Edward." Shame flooded through him. "I am sorry," he said. "I know it is wrong, but I could not stay away. The silence, the peace of being near you, it is addictive." "I do not mind," Bella said, and Edward stared at her in disbelief. "Knowing you were there made me feel safe." "You should be terrified of me," Edward said. "Your survival instincts are clearly broken. Or maybe I just see something in you that you do not see in yourself," Bella said. "You keep calling yourself a monster, Edward. But monsters do not choose to drink animal blood instead of human blood. They do not save girls from getting assaulted. You are not a monster. You are just someone trying very hard to be good despite what you are." "I want to kill you," he said, forcing the words out. "Right now, I want to drain you dry. The thirst is burning in my throat. How is that not monstrous?" "Because you are winning that battle," Bella said. "You are choosing me, my life, over your own desires. That is not monstrous. That is heroic." The cloud shifted and the sunlight faded, but Bella's hand remained on his face, warm and real and grounding. Edward understood that he had lost the battle to stay away from her, lost any hope of being rational. He loved her, this human girl who saw something in him worth staying for. "What do we do now?" Bella asked softly. "Now," Edward said, "we figure out how to make this impossible thing work, if you are certain." "I am certain," Bella said. "I want to stay." And Edward, for the first time in his long existence, allowed himself to hope that forever might actually mean something. The invitation came the following week, delivered by Edward with a casualness that belied the significance of what he was asking. Bella had been sitting beside him in biology, working through a lab on genetic inheritance, when he turned to her with an expression that managed to be both hopeful and anxious. "My family wants to meet you," he said quietly. "Properly, I mean. Not just passing in the hallways at school. They would like you to come to our house this weekend, if you are willing." Bella's heartbeat accelerated, and Edward wished desperately that he could hear her thoughts in that moment. Was she nervous, excited, afraid? Her face revealed little beyond a slight widening of her eyes. "I would like that," she said finally. "I want to know them. They are important to you, so they are important to me." The simple statement made something in Edward's chest constrict painfully. She wanted to know his family because they mattered to him, as if it were that simple, that obvious. The assumption of connection implicit in her words was both beautiful and terrifying. Edward had warned his family, of course, had told them that Bella knew what they were, that she had accepted the truth with remarkable calm, that she wanted to meet them despite understanding the danger. The reactions had been varied and predictable. Alice was thrilled, her visions showing fragments of Bella integrating into their family, though the images remained frustratingly unclear, always slightly out of focus, as if something about Bella resisted precognitive observation. Emmett found the entire situation entertaining, his thoughts full of jokes about Edward finally finding someone who could tolerate his brooding nature. Jasper was cautious, his military training making him assess Bella as a potential security risk, but he was willing to try for Edward's sake. Esme was maternal and welcoming, already thinking of Bella as another child to nurture and protect. Carlyle was supportive but concerned, understanding Edward's feelings while also seeing the larger dangers this relationship represented. And Rosalie was angry. Her thoughts were sharp with resentment every time Edward's mind touched hers. She saw Bella as someone throwing away the precious gift of humanity that Rosalie would give anything to have back, and she resented Edward for encouraging this recklessness. Saturday arrived grey and overcast, typical for Fawkes. Edward picked up Bella at noon, aware of Charlie's suspicious thoughts as he watched them leave. Charlie did not trust Edward, could sense something off about him even if he could not articulate what it was. The protective instincts of a father combined with the trained observation of a police chief made Charlie more perceptive than most humans. The drive to the Cullen house took them away from town, following winding roads into the forest until they reached the place Edward had called home for the past 2 years. The house emerged from the trees gradually, all glass and pale wood, modern architecture that seemed to grow organically from the landscape around it. Edward heard Bella's sharp intake of breath and glanced at her, seeing wonder on her face. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "Esme designed it," Edward explained. "She has a gift for creating spaces that feel both modern and organic. She has been working on houses for decades, perfecting her craft." The front door opened before they reached it, and Esme appeared, her caramel hair framing a face that radiated maternal warmth despite her marble features. "Bella," she said, her voice gentle, "we are so happy you are here. Edward has told us so much about you." Edward heard Bella's heart accelerate again and wished he could comfort her, could tell her there was nothing to fear. But there was plenty to fear, actually. She was walking into a house full of predators, entering the home of creatures designed to hunt and kill humans. The fact that his family chose not to act on those instincts did not make them any less dangerous. Inside, the house was exactly as it always was, open and airy, with glass walls looking out onto the forest and river beyond. Minimal furniture arranged more for aesthetics than comfort, since vampires did not need to rest. Everything carefully designed to be beautiful, while revealing nothing of what the inhabitants truly were. The family was arranged in the living room with calculated casualness. Alice perched on the arm of a white sofa, her pixie features bright with barely contained enthusiasm. Beside her stood Jasper, tall and controlled, his posture military straight despite the casual clothing. Emmett sprawled in an armchair, his massive frame making the furniture look delicate. Carlyle descended the stairs with the grace of centuries of practice, his kind face welcoming, and Rosalie stood by the window, her spectacular beauty almost painful to look at, her expression carefully neutral. Edward heard all their thoughts simultaneously, Alice seeing fragments of possible futures, Jasper feeling Bella's nervousness and trying to send waves of calm without being too obvious about it, Emmett thinking this was the most entertainment he had had in months, Carlyle assessing Bella with a doctor's eye, noting her pallor and elevated heart rate, Esme already thinking of Bella as family, as another child to protect and nurture, and Rosalie thinking bitter thoughts about human fragility and foolish choices. "Everyone, this is Bella," Edward said, though the introduction was unnecessary since they all knew exactly who she was. "Bella, you have met Carlyle at the hospital. This is Esme, Alice and Jasper, Emmett and Rosalie." "It is nice to meet you all properly," Bella said, her voice steadier than Edward would have expected given her racing heartbeat. "Thank you for having me in your home." "Of course, dear," Esme said warmly, gesturing toward the seating area. "Please sit. Make yourself comfortable. Can I get you anything? Water? Food? I am afraid we do not keep much in the kitchen, but I can certainly prepare something if you are hungry." Edward heard the slight humour in Esme's thoughts, the acknowledgement of how strange it was to offer food they could not eat themselves. But she was trying, making an effort to be hospitable in the way humans expected. Bella sat carefully on the sofa, and Edward settled beside her, hyper-aware of the space between them, of her scent filling the room, of the way every vampire present was carefully not breathing too deeply. The thirst was there for all of them, though it was manageable, controlled through decades of practice and recent hunting. But Bella's presence made the room feel charged, electric with controlled tension. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing with careful normalcy. Carlyle asked Bella about her life in Phoenix, about her mother, about her adjustment to Forks. He was genuinely interested, his medical training making him naturally curious about human psychology and adaptation. Esme wanted to know about her interests, her hobbies, the things that brought her joy. She asked about books and music, and whether Bella had any interest in design or architecture. Alice chatted about fashion and shopping, already planning future outings despite Bella's obvious discomfort with the topic. Edward heard Alice's thoughts, the visions she was having of taking Bella to Seattle or Portland for shopping trips, of helping her find clothes that suited her better than the simple jeans and t-shirts she usually wore. Emmett told exaggerated stories about hunting bears, making Bella laugh despite the underlying violence of his tales. He described wrestling a grizzly in the mountains, the challenge of taking down prey so much larger than the deer and elk they usually hunted. His thoughts were gleeful, enjoying Bella's reactions, appreciating that she could laugh at vampire activities rather than being horrified. Jasper remained mostly quiet, keeping his distance, using his gift to manage the emotions in the room, but careful not to manipulate too obviously. Edward heard his thoughts, the constant assessment of threat levels, the awareness of every vampire's thirst, and Bella's vulnerability. Jasper was treating this like a military operation, monitoring variables, preparing for problems. And through it all, Edward watched Bella, noting how she responded to each family member, how she held herself with nervous dignity, how she was genuinely trying to connect with these immortal beings who could kill her so easily. She asked intelligent questions, listened carefully to their answers, and treated them like people rather than monsters. Edward had never loved her more than in this moment, watching her bridge the impossible gap between human and vampire with grace and courage. Rosalie barely spoke, her thoughts cold and resentful throughout the afternoon. Edward heard her internal monologue, the bitterness about Bella's presence, the anger at what she represented. But Rosalie was being civil, maintaining a facade of politeness, even if her thoughts betrayed her true feelings. The afternoon wore into evening, and Edward felt something shift in the atmosphere. Alice suddenly went rigid, her eyes losing focus in that particular way that meant a vision was consuming her attention. Edward immediately focused on her thoughts, reading the images flickering through her mind. A storm, thunder rolling across the mountains, lightning illuminating dark clouds, rain falling in sheets, the perfect conditions for baseball. "Tomorrow night," Alice said when she came back to herself, her eyes finding Edward's, "there is a huge storm coming in. We should play." "Play what?" Bella asked, looking between Alice and Edward in confusion. "Baseball," Emmett said with obvious enthusiasm, his thoughts full of competitive excitement. "It is the one sport we can really cut loose with, but we need a thunderstorm to play properly." "Why a thunderstorm?" Bella asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Because of the noise we make," Edward explained. "When we hit the ball, when we run, when we collide, we are not exactly quiet about it. We need thunder to cover the sound of us playing. Otherwise, we would draw way too much attention." "You should come watch," Alice said to Bella, her enthusiasm infectious. "It is really something to see. We do not get to play often, so when we do, we make the most of it." Edward heard the invitation in Alice's thoughts, the vision she had had of Bella at the game, of the joy and freedom of playing without restraint. But he also heard something else, something darker lurking at the edges of Alice's vision, something she was not quite seeing clearly, something that worried her even if she could not identify what it was. "Would that be safe?" Bella asked, looking at Edward with concern. "Me being there while you all play?" "You would stay on the sidelines," Edward said, "far enough away to be safe from any stray balls or collisions. We will be careful." He did not mention the shadow in Alice's vision, the uncertain danger she could not quite see. Did not want to worry Bella unnecessarily when it might be nothing, might just be Alice's sight being fuzzy around Bella, as it always was. "Then I would love to come," Bella said, her face brightening. "I want to see you play, see you being yourself without holding back." The sentiment touched Edward more deeply than she could know. She wanted to see him unleashed, wanted to witness what he truly was when he was not carefully controlling every movement and gesture. She wanted to know him completely, and that vulnerability, that openness, was both terrifying and precious. As evening deepened toward night, Edward drove Bella home. At her door, she turned to him with a smile that made his silent heart ache. "They are wonderful," she said softly. "Your family, even Rosalie, though I do not think she likes me very much." "She does not dislike you personally," Edward tried to explain. "She dislikes what you represent, the human life she lost, the choices she was never given. It is complicated." "I understand," Bella said, "or I am trying to. This must all be so strange for them. A human knowing what they are, being in their home, being part of your life. I am grateful they are willing to try." Sunday passed too quickly. Edward spent the day hunting with his brothers, gorging himself on animal blood to ensure maximum control during the game, with Bella nearby watching. Emmett was excited, his thoughts full of competitive strategies and anticipation. Jasper was cautious, already planning defensive positions, thinking about how to keep Bella safe if something went wrong. And Edward was anxious, the shadow of Alice's incomplete vision nagging at him. As evening approached and storm clouds gathered over the mountains, the Cullen family prepared for their game. They dressed casually, knowing they would be moving through forest and field, knowing they could ruin clothing with their speed and strength. Alice was vibrating with barely contained energy, already seeing pieces of the game in her visions, calling out plays before they happened. Edward picked up Bella just as the first drops of rain began to fall. She was dressed warmly, prepared for spending hours outside in the storm, her face bright with anticipation, despite the anxiety he could hear in her accelerating heartbeat. The drive to the clearing took them deep into the wilderness, following roads that were barely more than tracks through the forest. Emmett drove the jeep like he was fleeing pursuers, taking corners at speeds that would have terrified anyone who did not know his capabilities. Bella gripped her seat but did not complain, trusting in ways that continued to amaze Edward. The clearing was massive, a meadow carved out of the forest, easily big enough for their purposes. Thunder already rolled overhead, and lightning flickered in the darkening sky. Perfect conditions. The rain fell steadily, soaking everything, but none of them minded. Vampires did not feel cold the way humans did. Edward helped Bella from the vehicle and guided her to the edge of the tree line, where she would be safe from any stray bulls or vampires moving at full speed. "Stay here," he said, his voice nearly lost in the thunder. "Do not move from this spot. We will be moving fast, and I need to know exactly where you are at all times." Bella nodded, and Edward kissed her forehead before joining his family in the clearing. The moment he stepped away from her, he felt the loss of her presence, the absence of her warmth. But he also felt something else: freedom. The permission to move without restraint, to use his full strength and speed, to be completely himself without worrying about appearing human. The game began with Esme pitching to Carlyle. Edward heard the thoughts of his siblings, the competitive drive, the joy of being able to play without holding back. Esme threw the ball with inhuman speed, and when Carlyle's bat connected, the crack of impact was like an explosion, echoing across the clearing loud enough to rival the thunder. The ball rocketed into the sky, disappearing into the storm clouds, and Edward was already running, his feet barely touching the ground, covering impossible distances in seconds. He tracked the ball by sound and instinct, positioning himself perfectly to catch it as it came screaming back down from the clouds. "Out," Esme called, and Edward felt the familiar satisfaction of a good play. They rotated positions, and now Emmett was batting. His thoughts were full of competitive fire, the desire to hit harder and farther than anyone else. When the ball came, he swung with such force that the crack seemed to shake the earth itself. The ball shot away at an angle that defied physics, and both Rosalie and Jasper converged on where it would land. Edward found himself at bat eventually. He could see Bella watching from the tree line, could feel her eyes on him even from across the clearing. When the ball came, he swung with all his strength, sending it rocketing into the sky, and he ran, pushing his speed to the limit, reveling in the freedom of movement. The game continued, and Edward lost himself in the pure joy of it. This was what he had been before Bella, this physical release, this freedom to be completely himself without apology or restraint. But now, with Bella watching, the joy was different, deeper, because she was seeing him truly unleashed and not running, not afraid, just watching with what he hoped was wonder. Edward was mid-leap, tracking a ball Esme had hit into the stratosphere, when Alice, suddenly froze. Edward felt it immediately, the cessation of her thoughts, the way she went completely still in that particular way that meant a powerful vision was overwhelming her. He landed with the ball, but immediately focused on Alice's mind, reading the images flickering through her consciousness. 3 figures emerging from the forest, not family, not expected. Vampires drawn by the sound of their game. Nomads traveling through and curious about others of their kind. And something else, something darker in Alice's vision, though she could not see what it was clearly. Just a sense of threat, of danger, of something going wrong. Edward's entire body went cold despite the impossibility of it. Visitors, strangers, and Bella, standing exposed at the edge of the clearing, her human scent about to spread across the meadow on the wind. "Alice," Carlyle called, noticing her stillness, his thoughts immediately concerned. "Company," Alice said, her voice tight with worry. 3 of them. They heard us playing and they are coming to investigate. We have maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Not enough time to get Bella away, to remove her from danger. And Edward knew with terrible certainty that this was the shadow Alice had been seeing, the unclear threat that had been lurking at the edge of her visions. This was the moment everything changed, where their secret became exposed, where Bella's knowledge of them became common knowledge among other vampires, and Edward had no idea how to protect her from what was coming. 3 minutes became 2, became 1, and the nomad vampires emerged from the forest with the casual confidence of apex predators who had never encountered a threat they could not handle. Edward read their thoughts as they approached, cataloguing information, assessing danger, trying to determine how this encounter would unfold. The leader was a dark-skinned man with long dreadlocks, his features aristocratic and intelligent, his bearing suggesting both confidence and diplomacy. His name was Laurent, and his thoughts were genuinely curious and friendly, pleased to encounter other vampires and hoping for pleasant interaction rather than conflict. Beside him walked a woman with wild red hair that cascaded down her back in untamed waves, her feline beauty sharp and dangerous, her golden eyes constantly scanning and assessing. Victoria, her thoughts more cautious than Laurent's, her mind working quickly to catalogue threats and escape routes, to understand the power dynamics of this larger coven. And the third was massive, easily matching Emmett's size, with pale skin and honey-coloured hair, his features handsome but somehow empty behind the friendly smile. James. And his thoughts were different from the others, harder to read, more focused on sensation than conscious reasoning. A hunter's mind, Edward realized with growing dread. Someone who thought in terms of prey and pursuit, rather than complex social interaction. Laurent raised one hand in greeting as they approached, his smile revealing teeth that were just slightly too white, too perfect. "We heard you playing from quite a distance," he said, his voice smooth and carrying a faint French accent. "I am Laurent. These are Victoria and James. We thought we would see if you would welcome some new players." Edward heard the diplomacy in Laurent's thoughts, the genuine desire for friendly interaction. Laurent was weary of the nomadic existence, tired of constant movement and conflict, hoping this coven might be different. "I am Carlyle," Carlyle said, his voice warm but carefully neutral. "This is my family. We are happy to make your acquaintance, though I am afraid we were just finishing up our game." Edward heard Carlyle's thoughts, The careful calculation of how to be welcoming without inviting prolonged contact. Carlyle was buying time, trying to assess the situation, trying to determine if these nomads pose a threat beyond the obvious danger. Laurent's eyes swept across the Cullens with obvious interest, cataloguing details, noting the unusual size of their coven. Edward kept his position near Bella, his body angled to block her from view as much as possible, praying that the wind would not shift, that her scent would not carry across the clearing. But prayers meant nothing to meteorology. The wind shifted. Edward felt it before he saw it. The change in air pressure, the shift in direction that would carry Bella's scent directly across the clearing to the three nomads. He tried to position himself more completely between Bella and the visitors, tried to block as much of her scent as possible with his own body, but he knew it was futile. The scent hit James like a drug. Edward read it in his thoughts, the immediate and overwhelming response, the way every other consideration vanished in the face of that smell. James's pupils dilated, his nostrils flared, and his entire body shifted into a crouch before he could consciously decide to move. Edward reacted instantly, dropping into an answering crouch directly in front of Bella, a snarl ripping from his throat that sounded nothing like anything human or civilized. It was pure threat, pure predator warning another predator away from his territory, from his mate, from the thing he would kill to protect. The sound of Edward's snarl triggered immediate responses from his family. Emmett moved to Edward's side with frightening speed, his massive frame radiating violent readiness. Jasper's military training became evident in the way he positioned himself, angling for tactical advantage. Even Esme's gentle features hardened into something dangerous, her maternal instincts transforming her into a threat. James had dropped into a full hunting crouch, his body coiled to spring, his eyes locked on Bella with an intensity that made Edward's vision narrow with rage. Edward could hear James's thoughts clearly now, the predatory focus snapping into place like a trap closing. This was not about food for James. This was about the hunt, about the challenge, about proving himself against a protected prey. Victoria had moved beside James, her own posture predatory and ready. Edward read her thoughts, the calculation behind her golden eyes. She was assessing the Cullens' defensive formation, noting the way they had surrounded the human, understanding that taking this prey would require going through 7 vampires. Only Laurent remained standing, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, though Edward could see the tension in his body. "We did not realize you were traveling with a human," Laurent said carefully, his thoughts genuinely apologetic. "We mean no offense." "She's with us," Carlyle said, his voice holding an edge Edward had rarely heard. "She is under our protection." Edward heard the warning in Carlyle's thoughts, the message being sent. This human was claimed. Attacking her would mean attacking the entire Cullen Coven. But James was not thinking about odds or strategy or consequences. His thoughts were consumed with the hunt, with the challenge this situation represented. A human protected by 7 vampires. It was perfect. The most interesting hunt he had encountered in years. "You brought a snack," James said, his voice holding a tone that made Edward's snarl deepen. "How thoughtful." "She's not food," Edward snarled, his voice barely recognizable as his own. "Back away, now." For a long moment, nobody moved. The two groups faced each other across the rain-soaked clearing, Vampires against vampires, the tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Thunder rolled overhead, and lightning illuminated the tableau in stark white flashes. Then Laurent laughed, the sound deliberately casual, deliberately breaking the tension. Of course, he said, his thoughts broadcasting diplomatic intent. We meant no disrespect. We were simply surprised. It is unusual to see your kind travelling with humans. The standoff dissolved gradually, the nomads backing away with James casting one last predatory look at Bella before disappearing into the forest. But Edward could hear James's thoughts even as he left, the plans already forming, the obsession taking root. James would hunt Bella, would pursue her with single-minded determination. This was not over. Edward and his family moved quickly, getting Bella away from the clearing, away from the lingering scent of the nomads. They drove in tense silence back toward Forks, Edward's mind racing through possibilities, through plans, through increasingly desperate scenarios. He is going to hunt her, Edward said finally, breaking the silence. James, I can hear his thoughts. This is not about feeding for him. This is about sport, about challenge. He will not stop until he catches her, or one of us stops him. Then we stop him, Emmett said, his thoughts full of violent readiness. It is not that simple, Jasper said, his military training making him see the tactical complications. Trackers are good at what they do. They are patient, methodical, difficult to predict. And he has Victoria with him, who is clearly intelligent and cautious. Alice's eyes were distant, flickering through visions, trying to track James's movements and intentions. But her sight was fragmentary, unclear, showing pieces rather than complete pictures. James was keeping his plans fluid, making decisions at the last moment to obscure precognitive observation. They took Bella to her house, where they would need to convince Charlie to let her leave, to get her somewhere safer, while they dealt with James. Edward's mind was already working through the logistics, through the lies they would need to tell, through the complications of protecting a human from a vampire tracker. But even as they planned, even as they prepared to send Bella away with Alice and Jasper, Edward could hear James's thoughts in the distance. The tracker was circling, staying close, already planning his approach, and his thoughts were focused entirely on Bella, on her scent, on the challenge she represented, on the satisfaction he would feel when he finally caught her. The next days were a blur of activity and fear. They created false trails, leading north toward Canada, making it seem like they were fleeing with Bella. Meanwhile, Alice took Bella south and west toward Phoenix, using routes that would be harder for James to track. Edward, Carlisle, and Emmett moved through the forest with grim purpose, laying false trails, creating evidence of Bella's passage in places she had never been. They were careful about it, making it seem like they were trying to hide her scent but failing, leaving just enough trace for a skilled tracker to follow. And through it all, Edward tracked James's thoughts, listening to the hunter's consciousness as he examined their trails, as he followed the false leads, as he gradually became convinced they were taking Bella north. But James was smart, too smart. After 2 days of following their trail, Edward heard the shift in James's thoughts, the moment when suspicion crystallized into certainty. The trail was too obvious, too easy to follow despite their apparent attempts at concealment. James had been deceived, and he did not like it. The hunter changed tactics then, abandoning the northern trail and circling back. Edward heard it in his thoughts, the determination to find the real trail, to locate where Bella had actually gone. And slowly, methodically, James began working his way through possibilities, eliminating false leads, narrowing his search. Edward called Alice immediately, warning her that James had figured out their deception. Alice's visions shifted, showing her pieces of James's new approach, of the danger closing in despite their best efforts. "He's going to Phoenix," Alice said, her voice tight with worry. "I can see it now. He has figured out where Bella actually went, and he is heading that way." Edward felt cold dread settle in his stomach, despite the impossibility of it. James was going to Phoenix, was hunting Bella with full knowledge of where she was. And despite Jasper's military training and Alice's visions, despite all their preparations and precautions, Bella was in danger. "We are coming," Edward said. "Stay with her. Do not let her out of your sight. We will be there as soon as we can." The drive to Phoenix was torture. Even pushing the Volvo to its limits, even driving through the night without stopping, it would take them over 20 hours to reach Arizona. 20 hours during which Bella would be vulnerable, during which James could be closing in, during which everything could go wrong. Edward drove with reckless desperation, Carlisle and Emmett silent in the car with him. His phone rang constantly, Alice calling with updates, with fragments of visions that shifted too quickly to provide clear guidance. Jasper reporting on Bella's condition, on her fear and her determination to be brave despite the terror she must be feeling. And through it all, Edward listened to James's thoughts, tracking the hunter's progress toward Phoenix, hearing the anticipation building as James closed in on his prey. On the second day, Edward heard something that made his blood run cold despite the impossibility of it. James had stopped moving. His thoughts had shifted from pursuit to planning, from tracking to strategy. He was in Phoenix, had somehow gotten ahead of them, and he was setting a trap. Edward tried to warn Alice, tried to tell her that James was already there, that they needed to move Bella immediately. But Alice's visions were becoming fragmented, unclear, as if James was deliberately keeping his plans fluid to obscure them from precognitive sight. Then Edward heard it in James's thoughts. Not just a plan, but an execution. James had found a way to lure Bella away from her protectors, had discovered a weakness in their defenses, and was exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. He had called Bella, had used her mother's voice, recordings James had somehow obtained, manipulated to sound like a current phone call. He had made Bella believe her mother was in danger, was being held hostage, would be killed unless Bella came alone. And Bella, brave, foolish Bella, had believed it, had left the hotel room where Alice and Jasper were supposed to be protecting her, had headed directly into James's trap, sacrificing herself for someone who was not even in danger. Edward heard all of this through James's triumphant thoughts, heard the tracker's satisfaction at his own cleverness, at how easily he had manipulated the situation. And Edward was still hours away, still too far to stop what was about to happen, still racing desperately toward Phoenix while knowing with terrible certainty that he was going to be too late. James had taken Bella to a dance studio, someplace from her childhood, somewhere she knew and therefore trusted. The familiar ground made the prey feel safer, made them easier to manipulate. Edward could see it through James's thoughts, could visualize the space, the mirrors lining the walls, the hardwood floor, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through high windows. And Bella, walking into this trap, completely unaware that her mother was safe at home, that James had never had her, that this was all an elaborate deception to separate her from her protectors. Edward's phone rang. James's number. For one irrational moment, hope blared in Edward's chest. But when he answered, it was James's voice on the other end, smooth and pleased with himself. "Hello, Edward," James said, and Edward could hear the smile in his voice. "I thought you might like to know that your little human is here with me now." She came quite willingly, ready to sacrifice herself for her mother. It was touching, really, the depth of love humans are capable of despite their brevity. "If you hurt her," Edward said, his voice barely recognizable as his own, "I will make your death last days. I will tear you apart piece by piece and burn each piece separately while you watch. Do you understand me, James? There is no future where you survive what I will do to you if you harm her." Such passion, James said, his tone mocking. Such devotion to a creature that will be dead in a handful of decades regardless. But I suppose that is what makes this so satisfying. Knowing how much you care, knowing how much this will hurt you. That is the real art of the hunt, Edward. Not just taking the prey, but breaking the one who tried to protect them. The line went dead. Edward threw the phone with enough force that it shattered against the dashboard. Beside him, Carlyle said nothing, but Edward could hear his thoughts, the concern and the determination, and the absolute commitment to stopping James no matter what it took. "How much longer?" Edward asked, his voice rough. 15 minutes, Carlyle said. "Maybe less if we push it." 15 minutes. An eternity when Bella was with James, when the tracker had her completely at his mercy, when anything could be happening in that dance studio. Edward pushed harder, the Volvo's engine screaming in protest, the speedometer climbing past numbers that should have been impossible. The strip mall appeared on the horizon, and Edward felt the battle between the need for caution and the desperate urgency of reaching Bella before it was too late. He abandoned caution entirely. The moment the car stopped, Edward was out and running, covering the distance to the dance studio with inhuman speed. He could hear Bella's heartbeat from outside the building, rapid and weak, could hear her labored breathing, could hear the sounds of violence that made his vision narrow to a single point of focus. The door disintegrated under Edward's assault, wood and metal tearing like paper as he burst into the studio. The scene that greeted him would haunt him for eternity. Bella lay among broken mirrors, blood pooling around her, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Her face was pale, her eyes glazed with pain and shock, and the scent of her blood hit Edward with overwhelming force. But he barely registered the thirst, barely felt the burn in his throat, because all he could focus on was the damage James had done, the injuries that might already be too severe to survive. James stood over her, his face twisted with satisfaction, and Edward heard his thoughts clearly. The hunter was pleased with his work, proud of what he had accomplished, already anticipating Edward's arrival and the psychological torture of watching him discover what had been done. Edward's attack was pure instinct and rage. He hit James with enough force to send both of them through the wall into the adjacent unit, plaster and studs exploding around them. Edward's hands found James's throat, his fingers digging into marble flesh, and for the first time in decades, Edward gave himself fully to the monster inside him. He was dimly aware of Carlyle, Alice, Jasper and Emmett arriving, of their voices calling to him, of Carlyle trying to tend to Bella, while the others moved to help Edward destroy James. But Edward's entire focus was on the vampire beneath him, on making him pay for every moment of fear Bella had experienced, for every drop of blood she had lost, for daring to hurt the one person Edward loved more than his own existence. Emmett joined the fight, his massive strength adding to Edward's fury. Together they tore James apart, literally ripping limbs from torso, destroying the hunter piece by piece. Jasper moved with military precision, ensuring James had no chance to escape, no possibility of regathering his strength. Through it all, Edward heard Carlyle's thoughts, urgent and desperate. Bella was dying. The blood loss was severe, the injuries extensive, and there was something else. Venom. James had bitten her, not to drain her but to transform her, letting the venom spread through her system while he waited for Edward to arrive. The realization hit Edward like a physical blow. James had not just been trying to kill Bella. He had been trying to force Edward's hand, to make him either watch her die slowly from the transformation, or be forced to kill her himself to prevent it. The cruelty of it, the calculated psychological torture, made Edward's rage burn even hotter. Alice appeared beside him, her small hands helping to restrain what remained of James. "Edward," she said urgently, "Carlyle needs you. Bella needs you. Let us finish this." Edward wanted to argue, wanted to personally burn every piece of James until nothing remained but ash. But Alice was right. Bella needed him. And nothing, not even vengeance, was more important than that. He released James to his siblings and ran back to where Carlyle knelt beside Bella, his medical training evident in the way he was assessing her injuries, prioritizing, trying to determine what could be saved and what was already lost. "Her hand," Carlyle said urgently, looking up at Edward with desperate eyes. He bit her hand. "The venom is spreading. You have to suck it out, Edward, now, before it reaches her heart." Edward felt cold terror settle over him. Suck out the venom. Put his mouth to Bella's wound. Taste her blood. The one thing he had been resisting for months. The temptation that had driven him away from her that first day in biology. And do it while her blood was freely flowing, while the scent was overwhelming, while every instinct he possessed screamed at him to drink rather than stop. "I cannot," Edward whispered, the admission like broken glass in his throat. "Carlyle, I cannot. Her blood, I will not be able to stop." "You have to," Carlyle said fiercely. "If you do not, she will transform. Is that what you want? To condemn her to this existence because you could not control yourself?" Edward looked at Bella, at her pale face and glassy eyes, at the way she was barely conscious, barely hanging on. She was dying in front of him, and he had the power to save her. The question was whether he had the strength. He lifted her hand with trembling fingers, seeing the wound James had inflicted, seeing the venom already darkening the veins around the bite. He had seconds, maybe less, before the venom spread too far to be removed. Edward put his mouth to the wound and began to suck. The taste of her blood was everything he had imagined and worse. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, more potent than anything he had ever experienced. Every cell in his body screamed for more, demanded that he drink deeper, that he drain her completely and satisfy the thirst that had been burning in his throat since the moment he had first caught her scent. But beneath the maddening desire, beneath the monster's demands, Edward felt something stronger. Love. The knowledge that this person in his arms was more important than his thirst, more valuable than any temporary satisfaction. She was Bella, who had seen the monster in him and had chosen to stay anyway, who had trusted him with her life over and over despite having every reason not to. He could taste the venom mixed with her blood, bitter and wrong, and he pulled it out with careful desperation. His mind was screaming at him to drink, to take more, to satisfy the burning need. But he forced himself to focus on what he was doing, on removing the venom, on giving her a chance to survive this without transformation. Carlisle's hand touched his shoulder. "Edward, stop. The venom is gone. You have to stop now." But Edward could not stop. The blood was too sweet, the temptation too strong, and his control was slipping with every second that passed. He could feel himself losing the battle, feel the monster winning, and terror filled him at the thought of killing her himself after fighting so hard to save her. "Edward!" Carlisle's voice was sharp, commanding, pulling at him with the weight of centuries of authority. "Her blood is clean. You have to stop now. Edward, stop." The words penetrated through the haze of bloodlust, and Edward forced himself to pull away. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than resisting her scent that first day in biology, harder than the 3 days of transformation, harder than anything in his long immortal existence. But he did it. He released her hand and pulled back, his mouth stained with her blood, his body trembling with the effort of not returning to finish what he had started. Bella's heartbeat was weak but steady, her breathing shallow but present. She was alive, unconscious and badly injured, but alive. In the other room, Edward heard the whoosh of flames, smelled the acrid scent of burning vampire flesh. His family was destroying James, burning the pieces to ensure the hunter could never be reassembled, could never threaten anyone again. Ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called for help, though Edward was not sure who. Alice, probably, her visions showing her the need for human medical intervention. "She's going to be okay," Carlisle said quietly, his experienced hands checking Bella's pulse, her breathing, her injuries. "The blood loss is significant and she will need surgery for the leg, but she will survive this, Edward. You saved her." But Edward felt no triumph, no satisfaction in having succeeded. He felt only the crushing weight of what had almost happened, of how close he had come to losing her, of how his presence in her life had nearly gotten her killed. This was his fault, all of it. James had targeted Bella because of Edward, because she had been claimed by a vampire, because she had become important to someone the hunter wanted to break. If Edward had never spoken to her that day in biology, if he had maintained his distance, if he had left Forks when he should have, Bella would be safe. Instead, she was lying broken and bleeding in a dance studio, the victim of violence that existed because Edward had been too selfish to walk away. Edward Cullen is not the romantic hero Twilight presented. He's a century-old being obsessed with a teenage girl. He stalked her, violated her privacy, watched her sleep without permission for weeks before she knew. He made choices for her, followed her across state lines, inserted himself into her life with an intensity that should have terrified her. His love is genuine but also possessive. obsessive, built on an addiction to her silence and her blood. He's constantly battling the urge to kill her. This is not romantic. This is dangerous. The relationship's foundation is his need for the peace her silent mind provides, his fascination with the one person he cannot read, his thirst for blood that calls to him like nothing ever has. He sees himself accurately as a monster who wants to be good but may not succeed. The tragedy is that he loves her enough to know he should leave, but is too selfish to do it. Midnight Sun strips away the fantasy and shows the darkness underneath. It is a love story, yes, but one built on danger, obsession, and fundamental incompatibility. The real Edward is more complex, more damaged, more honest about his monstrous nature, and somehow knowing the truth makes the story more heartbreaking. Some love stories are beautiful because they are impossible, dangerous because they are real. Now close your eyes and drift, knowing that forever is both a promise and a curse.